I'm going to talk to you about what we call the ACES study, which means anomalous cognition with electromagnetic shielding. I'm Charles Tart. I'm going to be telling you about the study because I'm the person who knew about the discoveries that led to this in the first place, and the people actually running the study, the ACES as it were, are Randy Falver and Richard Knowles, both former students of mine that I can brag about, because you always like it when students turn out well. And you may get to actually see these people in person sometime if you go along. If I were being conventionally introduced as a speaker at some kind of conference or something, they would talk about the books I've published. That I was a professor at the University of California at Davis and at the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology. And basically, I'm somebody who's been researching for more than half a century on subjects like dreams, hypnosis, altered states of consciousness, meditation, psychedelics, parapsychology, all the really interesting stuff that most psychologists don't want to get anywhere near because it's too wild. But I think it's important and very interesting. And the theme that ties that together for me is that I've been trying to build bridges between the best of science and the best of spirituality. The result of that, after 50 years, has been my last book, The End of Materialism, in which I surveyed what's been discovered in parapsychology and applied it to what I know of spirituality, and realize that most people think that science has somehow disproven all religion and spirituality. And it's not the case at all. It hasn't been disproven. It's been ruled out because other ideas about the material nature of the world just ruled out religion. And that's not a scientific conclusion. So what I ended up concluding as I surveyed this was that it's perfectly reasonable to be both spiritual and scientific in your approach to life, and to show lots of discrimination and discernment in both of those areas, because there's a lot of foolishness called science and a lot of foolishness called religion, but there's very real, very important things on both sides of that equation. And some people back in the 1880s had this wonderful idea of why not take the method of science, which is a way of refining knowledge, as opposed to what current scientific ideas of the way reality is at any particular time. Why not take that method and apply it to some of the phenomena that happen in religion and spirituality and see if there was indeed something to it, to start separating out the signal from the noise, as it were. And so, as a teenager, I had my basement laboratory and I was a ham radio operator. And I had my shortwave receiver, a Hallicrafters SX71, beautiful receiver. I could hear shortwave broadcasts from all over the world, and a lot of times there was so much noise, static from electrical storms, from other electrical equipment, and so forth. So it was very hard to understand what people were actually saying on a lot of shortwave broadcasts. I learned in a very practical way about what I later learned as an engineer was called signal-to-noise ratio. The signal's what you want to hear, the information. The noise is anything that makes it hard for you to get that. And in reading a lot about parapsychology and extrasensory perception, I realized that while the experiments had shown that there's something happening there are several forms of extrasensory perception, the signal-to-noise ratio is very poor. That is, most of the time when somebody's trying to use ESP, they're really just guessing. They have ideas about what targets should be or something like that. That's noise. Only once in a while do they actually get the signal. So the signal-to-noise ratio is very bad in terms of ESP. So anything that could improve the signal-to-noise ratio in parapsychology studies, it would make it happen more often instead of guessing, would allow us to really forge ahead in understanding what ESP is, what it meant, and so forth. In terms of signal-to-noise ratio, our ability to control ESP and to understand it was like human ability to understand and control electricity for most of the history of the human race. You had these little static electrical effects. Sometimes if you comb your hair, it crackles a little, and you might be able to pick up a very light object like a feather, except a lot of days it doesn't work, and it wasn't until recently that we understood why. When the battery was invented, the voltaic pile as it was originally called, and you could get lots of electricity reliably from batteries, our knowledge of electricity zoomed ahead enormously. That's what we need to get to really understand ESP, figure out what it means in terms of spirituality and the like. Michael Faraday was a famous earlier physicist, 1791 to 1867. And what he discovered was that if you made a solid metal box, or you could even use metal screen if it was spaced closely together, you would get something like this, okay? I'm drawing here basically a 6 foot by 6 foot by 6 foot cube, and the outside boundary of it, which I've shown in yellow there, is thin sheet copper, all soldered together at the joints, held together with a plywood structure inside. And the whole thing sits on some glass blocks, so it's electrically isolated from ground. But then you can control what the electrical conditions on that Faraday cage are. Why would you want to do that? What's interesting about that? Well, the interesting thing about a Faraday cage is that it makes use of the fact that electricity is basically a flow of electrons, and electrons are all negatively charged, and they repel each other. Just like the same poles of a magnet repel each other, like charges repel each other. So when you add electrons to this metal cage, like by combing your hair or fancier methods, they run onto the metal surface, and they all spread out to get as far as possible from each other to minimize the need to repel each other. I shouldn't say need, I'm anthropomorphizing. But anyway, so what a Faraday cage does is shield you from electrical effects on the outside, from static electrical effects like that, or from radio waves or something like that, and it's very interesting. Here's an example of a Faraday cage made with a rather large wire mesh kind of scene. And the guy standing inside of it is being bombarded on the cage with several million volts of electricity, and he doesn't feel a thing. We set up a thing where the experimenter or agent was in one room with a set of targets to try to send telepathically. That's the stick figure in the lab coat is the experimenter there. And in the Faraday cage in the other room across the hall was the receiver, who had to arrange his or her set of targets to match those of the agent. Now, at that time, students were really interested in tarot cards. That was the mystical rage of the time. So we set up a thing with 10 tarot cards in little plastic boxes, and the agents would consult a random number table to randomize the order of their circle, and then the receiver's agent, no, I got the terminology backwards. The receiver, percipient, would try to arrange his boxes in the same way. There's an example of someone acting as the receiver. This is a difficult task as a telepathy task. By chance alone, you're going to get 0 or 1 each time you do this. You know, in the long term, the average will come out near 1. So when you do get a hit, you're kind of impressed by it because you know it's not likely to have happened just by guessing. Well, without going into technical details, it worked. My UC Davis students, acting as receivers and senders, significantly scored, and the electrical conditions of the Faraday cage made a difference in how well they scored. For the ACES study, anomalous cognition with electromagnetic shielding, a question will be, of course, could we get it to work again under somewhat different circumstances? We'll be using a Faraday tent rather than a Faraday cage, because then we can move it to several different places to make it much more convenient to people. The question will be, what's the best tuning of the setup to get both the shielding or the increase kinds of effects? There are several different things that can be done there. And Can we get any idea of why it works? How come this, because at first you wonder why. Telepathy is not electromagnetic. Okay, when people first got good evidence for telepathy and then people discovered brainwaves, somebody thought, oh, it's electrical signals to the brain and it's kind of like a mental radio sending it, but it turns out that's not the case. Telepathy doesn't behave like an electromagnetic radio would in any way. But why did it work? That's kind of interesting. So, a lot of interesting and important things could be discovered. Now, I'm deliberately not being real detailed about the electrical conditions and the like because I don't want a Hawthorne effect. Neither do the ACES, Dr. Falver and Dr. Knowles. We want to find out what's actually going on here. So don't worry about the particular conditions or what our biases at the moment might be, because they could change moment to moment anyway. But if you get involved in the tests, it'll be interesting. You'll help us learn something, and we'll thank you in advance for participating in the ACES study. Thank you. I didn't say much about the implications of the direction we can go with success in the ACES study, but I should say something more about that, and there are two major directions that can come out of it. What I might think of as applications and implications. The applications involve the practical use of various kinds of ESP. It's already been demonstrated in the remote viewing research that's gone on for more than a couple of decades that remote viewing, a kind of clairvoyance, getting images of distant places, can be extremely useful. Is there any reality to spirituality? We have a dominant philosophy of materialism in a lot of parts of the world today. We think consciousness is nothing but the brain. And if you talk about spirits or God or gods or psychic energies and all that, you're just imagining stuff. The brain is good at imagining stuff. But that's all it is, imagination. If you pray, you're basically talking to yourself. And, if you pray out loud, your prayer will go all the way to the walls of the room where it'll get absorbed and go no further. But once you see telepathy actually happening under laboratory conditions, well, doesn't say anything about gods who might or might not pay attention to prayers, but you can no longer say that a person's intentions and prayers are only confined to inside their skull or what they can immediately do with their muscles or their vocal cords or something like that. That's why I've been mainly interested in transpersonal psychology, implications of parapsychology, to show that there's more to a human being than just the physical brain. And that more is the kind of stuff we think of as spiritual. But something real is going on there. If we can begin to separate out, and it ain't going to be easy, what's real about this larger nature of man beyond just our physical capacities versus what is superstition, craziness, and whatnot, I think that's important. And also, as a transpersonal psychologist, I know that the spiritual side of human beings is important. If you don't have some kind of belief that there's some higher principles running the universe, that it's just the crazy mess you see around you, you don't thrive. It's a real problem. And so, of course, the tendency is to grab some religion and defend it as the truth, to make sense of it and not dare to ask any questions. But I think we could gradually develop a more scientifically based spirituality based on what actually happens in reality, and that would be good for us.